everyone, and welcome to our briefing on J Street's briefing on the post-election and our polling that we had done, have recently done. My name is Kevin Racklin. I'm the Vice President for Public Affairs at J Street, and I'm really excited to introduce my co-panelist today, Jim Gerstein, founding partner of GBAO Research and Strategy, and Jeremy Ben-Ami, the president of J Street. So without further ado, I want to go ahead and kick it over to Jeremy to say some opening words. Jeremy?
Terrific. Thanks so much, Kevin. And I know people are signing in as we are speaking. And so we will, I'll try to kill a little bit of time so that people don't miss Jim's presentation here. So I just want to start by saying that election night was, I think, for many people in the J Street world, a amazingly exceeding expectations evening. We certainly came out of the evening feeling very good about J Street's political work in the 2022 cycle. Jim's going to talk a little bit about our polling about American Jewish voters as a whole, but let me just say a couple of words at the outset about J Street's political work this cycle. I think first and foremost, we're excited that at this point, 91% of our PACs endorsees in the House won their general elections. That includes 88% of frontline incumbent endorsees and over 70% of challenger races that were considered by the DNC to be red to blue. 100% of our Senate incumbents won re-election, which is terrific. And we're particularly pleased to welcome John Fetterman into the U.S. Senate. And together with our existing endorsees, that means that over 60% of the Democrats in the U.S. Senate are currently J Street PAC endorsed. I'd highlight that one of the things that I find very interesting for J Street is that cycle after cycle, when you look at the races that are considered to be toss-ups in advance by the race callers, in this case, looking, let's say, at the Cook Political Report, the percentage of J Street endorsed candidates that win in toss-up races is usually higher than the average of the Democratic Party or of other groups. And I think partly that is because the type of people who affiliate themselves with J Street do very well in competitive races. But this time it was close to 90% of the House races that were deemed toss-ups by Cook will end up, it appears, we'll have to wait for the last few races to be called, but it appears that J Street PAC candidates will have won. Financially, J Street raised and distributed over $7 million to endorsed candidates. We raised $2.2 million through our Action Fund, which is our new super PAC. We averaged about closing in on $300,000 for priority Senate races and about $65,000 for frontline House incumbents. So we had a very, very good cycle. The majority of Democrats in the House of Representatives will once again be J Street endorsed. It's possible there will be a higher percentage of J Street candidates in J Street members of Congress in the Democratic caucus after this cycle than there actually were in the last Congress. So we're feeling really good, Kevin, about the work that we did, and I want to say thank you to all of the folks from within the J Street community who are watching us this evening. We know this was a really, really tight election, and every hour of phone banking, every dollar that was contributed, everything that was done to help these candidates get across the finish line makes a huge difference, not just for them winning, but as we all know, the democracy, the democratic foundations of this country were on the ballot this cycle, and they seem to have won and held strong, and we're really proud to have played a role in that. So that's our take politically on the election this year, and I think I'm turning it over to you, Jim, to walk us through the results of your polling, and you'll tell us a little bit about the poll and the headline results.
Great. Well, thanks, Jeremy, and thank you for everybody for joining. I really appreciate J Street sponsoring this research. It's a thrill really to be with everybody and have the opportunity to talk about these findings with you. And I have to say at the outset, it really is incredibly exciting for me to see what J Street has built over the past 14 or 15 years and the impact that the organization is making. And the numbers that Jeremy just cited are pretty stunning and exciting. And as we know, in these close elections, everything matters and everything makes a difference. So I really thank you for everything you're doing, and thank you for having me on to talk about these findings. When we look at the Jewish vote in this election, I would say it was actually fairly predictable, but even though it's predictable, it was also very noteworthy given the divisions in our country and the public discussion that we've been having over democracy and extremism. I say it's predictable because we continue to see very strong Democratic support, strongly identify Jewish voters strongly identifying with the Democratic Party and holding very intense opposition to Republicans. So that's been consistent for a long time. That's a predictable result. I'd say it's noteworthy though, because in a way that we haven't seen before. And because of the concerns that Jews in this survey are expressing over anti-Semitism, their views of Trump's role in rising anti-Semitism, and their disapproval of Jewish groups that would use Israel as a cover for supporting members of Congress who opposed the certification of the presidential election on January 6th. And I'll get into the numbers and show that show the data that leads to those points. But I think that we're obviously in very turbulent times, and this survey sheds a lot of light on where American Jews fit at this moment in a very polarized and politically divided country. So I'm going to share my screen, and we will jump into the actual data and numbers that lead to those points, and we will take questions later. So. Okay, so I'm just going to ask Jeremy, can you see my screen? So that means everybody can see my screen. Terrific. Thanks. So just to start out quickly, this was an election, this was a survey of people, of American Jews who voted in the 2022 election. We started conducting it on November 1st during the early vote period. We continued doing it through election day and election night. And there's a whole methodology section that you can go through on the J Street website where all of this data lives, where you can see the results for all the questions as well as the crosstabs. But I won't get into the weeds of methodology right now, other than to say that this was pulled from a national voter file of registered voters. But in order to qualify for the survey, you had to have already voted, and you had to have screened in as a Jewish voter. And we use the definitions provided by in the question wording that the Pew Research Center uses when conducting their Jewish surveys. So when we start by looking at the political context and what drives the vote, the first factor that we want to look at is what were the issues that were on the minds of Jewish voters. And this was quite a striking finding that the top issue among Jewish voters was the state of democracy. We asked people, what are the top two issues most important to you when deciding your vote for Congress? You can see the top one overall was the state of democracy. More than half of Jews cited that as one of their top two issues. And the next issue was abortion. After that, you see a pretty significant drop off to another tier of issues, starting with inflation in the economy, climate change and crime, and then a much lower tier of issues. You can see this concern about democracy was the top issue among Reform Jews, conservative Jews, and Jews without any denomination. The only audience that did not cite the state of democracy or abortion as their top two issues was the Orthodox population. In this survey, the Orthodox comprise 10% of the electorate, and so they're a minority within a minority. But and you'll see that they just have, in the survey, you'll see they have just a completely different set of political beliefs and values and worldview than the rest of the larger majority of the Jewish population. The second factor driving the vote is, really this overall political dynamic, is something we've seen for a long time, but is pretty intense in this election. And that is, there's broad support for Democrats. Joe Biden has a 67% favorable. That's what these green bars are. And Democratic Party, 66% have a favorable view of the Democratic Party. These gray bars at the bottom, that's the percentage of Jewish voters who said they have a negative view or an unfavorable view of this person or party. And when you look at the right side of this slide and you see all these net unfavorable ratings in the mid 70s to mid 80s, whether, ranging from Kevin McCarthy, who they know and don't like, all the way to Mitch McConnell, who they don't know and has astronomically high unfavorable ratings. As long as you see this perception of the Republican Party and its leaders, the dynamics are not going to change and move towards Republicans in terms of Jewish support. And there's nothing happening in the Republican Party right now that is going to dispel Jewish voters of their negative feelings towards the party. So they would need some radical transformation for the fundamentals in the Jewish vote to change. I would point out here as a bit of a side note that we also asked about Benjamin Netanyahu's favorability, and you can see the green bar going all the way back to one of our first surveys ever done for J Street in 2008, 2009, where he had a high favorability, 58 favorable, 27 unfavorable. And you can see over time, as the Prime Minister of Israel, it moved around a little bit, but was generally very positive. It started to decline significantly here, where you after 2014, you move into 2015 when he went on the House floor which was held by the Republicans, to criticize Obama and the deal that he negotiated with Iran. And you start to see Jewish voters start to have negative feelings towards Netanyahu, and his favorability drops significantly. It drops a lot more, and his unfavorable starts to rise as he hugs Donald Trump and Donald Trump hugs him. And by 2020, Netanyahu's unfavorable skyrockets to 61 unfavorable, and he's down at 31 favorable. We asked it in this survey to see if that dynamic was holding or changing, and it's very clear that that dynamic is holding. Jews in America continue to have a very negative view of Benjamin Netanyahu. And if you take a step back, that's a pretty stunning statement, because the person who holds the office of the prime ministership, or has and is about to again, should automatically have a high favorable out of respect to the office, and he has lost that, and it does not look like that is changing anytime in the near future. Then the other dynamic that's important to understand in this election was the strong support that Jewish voters have for Joe Biden. They think he's doing a good job. He's a 70% job approval rating, 30% disapprove. His job approval is about 28 to 30 points higher than what it is in the general population. That is a massive gap. It really shows that when it comes to this cultural divide in America, that the Jewish electorate is firmly in the camp of the Democrats, and they strongly support the job that this Democratic president, Joe Biden, is doing. You can see here, this transcends gender, where he's got very high approval with women. 81% of Jewish women give him a favorable approve of the job he's doing. 59% of Jewish men. That reflects a little bit of the gender gap that we see overall in the country, but still the Jewish men are far more approving of Biden than non-Jewish men. What you see here is also it crosses denomination, with Reform Jews being the most approving of Joe Biden, followed by those without a denomination. Those two groups, Reform and those without denomination, make up about 2/3 of the Jewish population. So that is a very important, has an important block of Jews to have so strongly favorable, so strongly approving of him. And you can see he also has strong approval regardless of age. So how does this play out in the actual vote? The headline, I guess, I'm sorry, it took a little while to get to the actual headline, but it's 74% for the Democrats, and 25% said that they voted for the Republican candidate running for Congress. So that is a large gap. That's quite consistent with what we've seen in the congressional vote during the Trump era. I say the Trump era, since 2016, that we have seen a bump in support for Jewish candidates. I'm sorry, a bump in support for Democratic candidates among Jewish voters. The historical average has been around 70%, so this is slightly higher than what you see historically. Again, it's been on the rise since Trump became the leader of the Republican Party. You can see again the vote across the different denominations and party identification. Very heavy support for the Democratic candidate, whether it's Reform, Conservative, or those without a denomination. Once again, the Orthodox population is the only group. They're 10% of the Jewish population, 20, and they are voting overwhelmingly Republican. You can see here Jewish by party ID, very strong consolidation for both parties voting for their candidate, and a 20-point gap in favor of the Democrats among independent Jewish voters. So that a lot of that, for those who've been on these calls every 2 years, probably looks very familiar. Here's something that is different and a new dynamic that I believe has been introduced into the Jewish vote, or the dynamics in the Jewish community and the Jewish vote. And the first thing I'd say is that we ask people, how concerned are you about anti-Semitism in the United States? And this darker shade of blue turquoise is those who say that they are very concerned. 85% of Jewish voters said that they are very concerned about anti-Semitism in the United States. Another 12% said they were somewhat concerned. So a total of 97% are either very or somewhat concerned. You see, this is true across the board among Jewish voters. This is one area where where each denomination has pretty much the same level of concern. You don't see any variation. This is a common thread. The next thing that we asked was, half the sample got a question that said, how responsible do you think Donald Trump and his allies in the Republican Party are for a rise in anti-Semitism? And the other half of the sample, you can see on the right side of this slide, asked, how responsible do you think Donald Trump and his allies in the Republican Party are for a rise in white supremacy? And this was quite a striking result. 67% say that Trump and the Republican Party are very responsible, and another 9% somewhat. So 76% say that Trump and his Republican allies in the Republican Party are responsible for a rise in anti-Semitism, compared to only 21% who say they're not responsible. There's very little distinction between their view on his responsibility about a rise in anti-Semitism compared to a rise in white supremacy. I think this is this is a big deal, big statement about the former president of the United States, and something that is so viscerally painful and important to American Jews. We had a follow-up question to this, in which he asked, do you think that Donald Trump and the MAGA movement are a threat to Jews in America? And a comparable percentage, 74%, say yes. So, and you can see again, the only population that doesn't believe that is the Orthodox population. We've done other research for the Jewish Electorate Institute that asked if people are more concerned about anti-Semitism that they see originating from the right versus anti-Semitism that they see originating from the left. It's overwhelmingly a concern about anti-Semitism emerging from that originates from the right. There is no, the idea that there's an equivalency between these two things is not where Jewish voters' minds are, and they're very concerned about this. We also have done focus groups in which you see how frightened they are about anti-Semitism, and they cite things like the Charlottesville demonstration several years ago, but they also look at January 6th and the riots on the Capitol and the image of the Camp Auschwitz shirt, and they see elements, they see this intersection between white supremacy, election denialism, anti-Semitism, the Trump and his MAGA movement, him emboldening this audience. And it's a real thing, it's a real concern, and I think that Jewish organizations that purport to represent American Jews need to really understand this to be able to navigate and not have a both sidesism out there, because this is a real concern for American Jews, and they don't see it as a both sides issue. And I think that the anti-Semitism piece is very important. It's a big deal on its own, but it also takes on some added significance when in this political environment. And like I said, Jews see Trump emboldening anti-Semites. And when they see things from Republicans or other organizations saying, well, it's okay to support these Republicans, or in the case of Doug Mastriano and his wife, it's okay to support us because we support Israel. And that argument is a complete misreading of American Jews. And it's just a fundamental misunderstanding to think that support for Israel would provide cover for election denialism or white supremacy or anti-Semitism. That is not how Jews feel about the issues, and for a few different reasons. So first, I'd start out by pointing out that Jews think it's compatible to be both pro-Israel and critical of Israeli government policy. This is a question we started asking 4 years ago, and you can see it's very consistent. 84% in 2018 said that somebody could be pro-Israel and critical of Israeli government policies. And that number has inched up a little bit over the past few years. Right now it sits at 89% of American Jews say that you can be critical of Israel and still be pro-Israel. You can see this also is consistent across age, gender, and denomination. We dug deeper into the specifics of this particular election, and we gave people the information and said, as you may know, AIPAC, a pro-Israel organization, endorsed and raised money for members of Congress who support Israel, but voted against certifying the 2020 presidential election on January 6th. Do you approve or disapprove of AIPAC endorsing and raising money for these members of Congress who support Israel, but voted against certifying the 2020 presidential election? This is a very factual presentation of what happened. We refer to these candidates as supporters of Israel, and the fact that they voted against certifying the 2020 presidential election. 72% of Jewish voters said that they disapprove of AIPAC endorsing those candidates. I think this is a very serious issue, and all Jewish organizations ought to take seriously and recognize how Jews feel in this particular partisan environment, cultural battle taking place in this country, and the power of what happened on January 6th and the election denialism taking place across the Republican Party. The other aspect is, as we know from past research and plays out here, American Jews have a rather liberal view of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and they want the U.S. to be engaged, and they want the U.S. to help the parties get to a peace agreement. This is a question we've been asking for 15 years. Do you support or oppose the U.S. playing an active role in helping the parties to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? It's a very easy question for people to say yes, they support that. It's a very, it doesn't introduce difficult information, difficult choices. But it's the first part of a two-part question. After they receive this question, we then ask people, well, would you support or oppose the U.S. playing an active role in helping the parties to resolve the conflict if it meant the U.S. exerting pressure on both the Israelis and Palestinians? Half the sample got that question, and 73% of the people who received that question said that they support the U.S. exerting pressure on both sides to make the compromises necessary to achieve peace. The other half of the sample only heard the U.S. exerting pressure on Israel, and there you see the support drop significantly. We went from that 86% before down to 58%. So when Israel singled out, it definitely reduces, it starts to raise people's concerns or their antenna about in a way that makes them a little bit uncomfortable, and that support drops to 58% and 26% who say strongly support. There are several other measures that we have in the survey that show how much Jews have a balanced and pro-peace approach to resolving the conflict. And I will go through these quickly because I know I've got a minute and a half left on my time. First, we asked them about a final status peace agreement with all the details. This is a question we've been asking for several years. And it basically, you can read these in detail later. It's all on the J Street website, but it basically talks about where Israeli, Palestinian, American negotiators left off last time they were in negotiations. It involves difficult compromises. And 69% said that of Jewish voters say they would support this agreement. It includes compensation for Palestinian refugees, 67 borders, Palestinian neighborhoods in Jerusalem becoming part of the new Palestinian state, while Israel retains control of Jewish neighborhoods in the Western Wall. So, the broad contours of what an agreement would look like, 69% support that agreement. We also asked people about a two-state solution compared to other options. Which of the following would be the best resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And here you see 61%, the clear majority are for establishing two states with their own separate governments, Jewish state of Israel alongside an Arab state of Palestine. There is a block of Jewish voters, not 24% here, who support annexation. You can see that is pretty similar to the 24% that are voting for the Republican candidate. That you see, that block at 24% who answer questions differently than the rest of the majority of the Jewish voters. You can see that is the annexation block. And then you see a very small block of 15% who are for a one-state solution that's neither Jewish nor Palestinian, includes a single government elected by both Israelis and Palestinians across Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. We've seen in this survey, past surveys, and qualitative research that we've done, a lot of opposition to the settlements. Here we get at settlement construction, and we ask people which of these views comes closest to their own point of view. Here what you see is 37% of Jewish voters think Israel should suspend all construction of settlements in the West Bank. 39% say that Israel should suspend construction that's outside the core settlement blocks, but continue construction in areas that are already developed. So a total of 76% who support some form of settlement of suspension of construction. And then again, this 24% number that keeps popping up, people who say Israel should build Israeli settlements in any area of the West Bank that it wants. Just a couple more questions quickly. We ask about aid and whether aid should be restricted so that it is not, so the U.S. would continue providing the same level of aid to Israel, but restricting it so that no U.S. aid or military equipment can be used to expand Israel's occupation of the West Bank. That's some tough language in there. Yet 68% say they support restricting assistance so that it is not used to expand the occupation. I think that's a rather striking number given the powerful language that's in here. And finally, on Iran, we ask two questions on Iran. The first is, it's a question that we've asked before about whether the U.S. should re-enter the agreement that Trump withdrew from. It's again, a very balanced question, talks about the agreement lifts economic sanctions against Iran in exchange for Iran dismantling its program and allowing international inspectors to monitor the facilities. This is language that was drawn from public polls as well. We see that 71% of Jews today say that that they support the U.S. re-entering this agreement. If and when there are negotiations about this, the U.S. government would have a lot of confidence that there's support for re-entering from Jewish voters. And finally, we asked who they think is more responsible for the U.S. withdrawing from the nuclear agreement with Iran, Donald Trump or the Iranian regime. And 83% said Donald Trump is more responsible. Now, I think we can read into this a couple of things. One is that this may be a little high because there are Republicans who hold him responsible, but think it was the right thing to do so that they don't have a problem with that. But I think it's still a pretty strong statement that people who want to re-enter the agreement are saying that Trump is more responsible than the Iranians for breaking the agreement. So I'm going to stop there and open it up for Kevin.
Thank you so much, Jim. That was incredibly interesting and enlightening, and I know everyone on the call appreciated that. While I'm waiting for questions to queue up, I'm going to take the moderator prerogative to actually ask my own question. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit about your general takeaways about the national vote beyond Jewish voters. And specifically, if you could give us some thoughts on what successful messaging worked for Democrats.
Sure. So we were involved in dozens of races this year. We still have one more to go with Raphael Warnock. So thank you for everything that you're doing for Warnock. And I'd say I have a few major takeaways about this election, and I think this ultimately will answer your question directly, Kevin. The first is that 6 months ago, every campaign call I was on was basically a gallows humor. I mean, we were headed towards a really bad result. This was going to be a major Republican wave, consistent with the historical patterns that we see in midterm elections. And then all of a sudden, maybe not all of a sudden, but then the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade. And I have not, in the years I've been working on this, almost as long as one Jeremy Ben-Ami, I have never seen, I've never seen a single event transform an election like this, with the exception of 9/11. Yeah, we've had long-lasting events, wars, recessions, things like that, but a single event completely transforming an election, the only time I've seen that happen before was 9/11. It's obviously a very different event with very different consequences. I'm not comparing the two events beyond the fact that they completely redefined what that election was about. So that's the first thing, that my first major takeaway. And that's not, that may not be breaking news to people, but I just want to emphasize how central that was, and that Democrats really stuck to it and ran on that. Second thing I'd say is this is a very evenly divided country. This is just the latest election expressing that. Small shifts in the vote have massive electoral ramifications, just as we saw in Israel, how small differences in the vote can have major ramifications. And we won a lot of these close races due to holding on to independents, specifically independent women and Hispanic women, who were critical in tons of Democratic victories in swing districts and in Senate races as well. This was heavily, once again, driven by the issue of abortion rights. And a little corollary on this point, and that is there was a lot of ticket splitting in this election. We saw a lot of ticket splitting in states like Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, Ohio. You mentioned, Kevin, a lot of ticket splitting there between the governor and the Senate race. And that, in large part, I think, is the result of the real mess in the Republican Party and the role that Trump is playing. I think his impact on this election took place a long time ago, when very popular Republican governors decided not to run for Senate because they knew Trump would mobilize Republican primary voters against them. Best examples are Doug Ducey in Arizona and Sununu in New Hampshire, even Larry Hogan in Maryland. I mean, that would be a tougher one, but he could have had an impact on some close House races. The point being that he worked to block these people from running and then worked to nominate their least electable candidates, such as Herschel Walker, Blake Masters, Mehmet Oz. So I'm not sure how they get out of this mess, but that's the role that I think, that's the impact of Trump in this election. And then to kind of get to your most directly answer your question, that's the preamble. But I would give a lot of credit to Democrats for running strong campaigns. Yeah, Democrats have their own challenges in uniting this party. There's a lot of, it's a big tent party, But there were a lot of outstanding candidates who ran disciplined campaigns in a really difficult political environment and stuck with it. Now, we should never feel good about losing the majority in the House, but this was a historic result. And the ultimate difference between the majority being lost or won, I can't believe I'm saying this, but it comes down to the difference between Florida's gerrymander passing and New York's gerrymander getting overturned. That ultimately is the difference between Democrats holding the House and Republicans holding the House. So this was a extremely close election. It, just as we've been seeing in a lot of elections, the country remains very evenly divided, and these little shifts make a mountain of difference.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to start turning to questions on that we're compiling up. So thank you to everyone who's asking questions. I'm seeing a lot of questions regarding the Orthodox and Hasidic communities. So I'm going to try to sum this up into 2 questions. And then I have a question coming up on your polling methodology. So the first question on the Orthodox and Hasidic communities, what dynamics are we seeing within these communities in terms of how they're voting? And how are they different than the other denominations that are being polled?
Okay, so first, the comparison between Orthodox and the rest of the Jewish population. It's just a fundamentally different set of political beliefs and values. I'm not saying that, I'm saying that descriptively. I mean, they just have different, they identify strongly with Republicans. They do not have the same issue priorities as you saw. Their issue priorities are things that are more things that the Republicans are driving and talking about, whether it was the economy and inflation to crime or immigration. I mean, the things that are animating Republican voters, those are the things that Orthodox voters are focused on. And obviously, to the extent that they talk about the same about issues, they have a more conservative, politically conservative view of these issues than the other 90% of the Jewish population that has very liberal views. I mean, the Reform, conservative, and Jews without a denomination have strong liberal progressive ideology and moderate ideology as well, but moderate in today's political culture is much closer towards the Democrats and the progressives, liberals, than it is to the conservatives. So that's the big difference. Now, and you see it just play out on all kinds of issues, whether it's Israel or domestic issues. So the second piece to the question is one I can't answer about, like the dynamics within the Orthodox population. It's because it's such a small portion of the Jewish population. We don't have a large enough sample sizes to look within the different demographics among the Orthodox population, whether it's different sects, different levels of Orthodox. This is all about how people self-identify. We don't assign the definition to them. We ask them in the survey, what denomination do you identify with? And so people who say Orthodox get identified as Orthodox, and those who say Reform, etc.
I'm glad you actually brought up your methodology as you were doing this. One of our dear friends on the call, Sid Grossman, had a couple questions regarding the methodology that I'm going to try to lump together into 2 main questions for you. And so the first is, what percentage of the Jews contacted ended up actually completing the survey, and what was the response rate? And then the second question on that is, and this goes to your question on sample size, to your response on sample size, is how do you conclude that 800 voters is a representative sample of the American Jewish community?
Sure. So I'll start with the second part of the question. The way survey methodology, survey statistical theory works is that we are taking a sample of a much larger population that we are trying to make as representative of that sample. So people are, the way we contact people is from a national voter file. We contact them by text. They then have to screen into the survey defining, saying that they are Jewish. We use the language that Pew asks when they screen for their kind of gold standard survey that they do every several years. And then the other screen that we have is that they have to identify as, that they have to say that they've already voted. So we then take this randomized sample and after we've completed the 800 interviews, that we then smooth out or weight the data to reflect known variables, because we aren't going to get we're going to get some response bias. I won't get too much into the weeds of methodology, but there is some response bias. Some people are more likely to take a survey than others. Others are more likely not to take surveys. And so we aren't going to just the random sample. It's not going to produce the truly representative sample. What we do then do is we do weight the data to our best known variables based on Pew's research, which is done at a much as rigorous of a methodology as can be done. They have a lot more money to do it, but they do a great service for Jewish research in publishing their data. And so we know what percentage of Jews should be certain age, what percentage should have certain denomination, what percentage male, female. And so we're able to take our raw data, weight it to some known variables, and make our best effort at a representative sample. Other things that give us confidence are the consistencies that we see over time. And just the fact that we have the benefit of being able to use voter files so that we know that we're starting out by talking with registered voters.
Thank you. So I'm going to shift slightly to youth voting and the age difference between the older generation and the younger generation of the Jewish population. A lot of people have been commenting in the chat and in the Q&A about the differences between the older generation and the younger generation in terms of voting. And we were hoping you could elaborate a little bit about that and the trends you're seeing around that.
Sure, it's a great question. Because everyone's assumption is that, oh, young people are the most liberal Democratic voters that are out there, and there is something to that Democrats really need young people to turn out and vote in large numbers because they hold an advantage with young voters. But there's an interesting dynamic in the Jewish population, and that is the younger vote is disproportionately Orthodox. There's a larger number of Orthodox in the youth vote than there, the under 30, under 40, than there is as people age in the older vote. So there's two dynamics. The first is that the younger vote is skewed a little bit by the Orthodox population within the younger vote. Just by way of example, for voters who are under the age of 40, the total Jewish population was 69 to 29 in favor of the Democrats. If you take out the Orthodox and it's only the non-Orthodox, that 69-29 bumps up to 79 to 19. Okay, so that is a vivid illustration, I think, of the impact of the Orthodox population within the youth vote impacting that vote. The other thing I would say is that older Jews are also very democratic and very liberal. And this comes from a very long history and association. A lot of them, immigrated to the United States or were children of immigrants. A lot of New Deal Jewish Democrats out there experiencing a lot of hostility over the years towards a Republican Party that was perceived as is not supportive of Jews. So I think that you have just two things going on in the Jewish populations that's different than the general population when it comes to the age dynamics. But again, just really remember that this is fundamentally a very liberal, progressive constituency that has identified with the Democratic Party for decades.
Thanks, Jim. I'm actually going to shift over to Jeremy now to ask him a question. Jeremy, obviously, you know this as well as anybody, is that many of our friends in the pro-Israel, pro-peace, pro-democracy community have either retired or, maybe they lost their primaries. I'm thinking of John Yarmouth from Kentucky, Andy Levin from Michigan, David Price from North Carolina. And so many people are curious of who you think the potential champions are in the 118th Congress and who we should be keeping our eyes out for.
Well, there really is an exciting class of new incoming freshmen, and there are people like just today I was talking to Becca Balint, who is the new member of Congress taking Peter Welch's place in Vermont, and she is a Jewish woman. She is a former president of the Vermont State Senate. She is very progressive. She aligns with J Street so deeply, and it was just wonderful to talk to her and know that sort of coming into the class you have somebody like that who's going to be a real champion. There's a bunch of folks, let's say like Seth Magaziner, also a new member from Rhode Island, happens to be Jewish. He was endorsed by us, won a really competitive race. He's really terrific. You have Nikki Buzinski in a new district in Illinois, and Eric Sorensen from Illinois, the woman in Michigan who beat one of the more out there MAGA folks, Hillary Skolton. She won, I think, by 15 or 16 points in Michigan's third. So there's just a whole array of terrific people who we were firmly behind. And then you've got a progressive core of new faces. And I want to highlight, of course, Summer Lee, who won the competitive race in Pittsburgh, that we backed her both in the primary and in the general election. And she's got a crew of folks. I was out in Chicago with Delia Ramirez, who was attacked by DMFI, and I think a couple $1 million may have been spent against her. I'm not sure of the exact amount, but maybe it wasn't quite that much. But she was under attack from sort of center right in our community, and she ran away with that one, and is really going to be terrific. I was pleased to be on stage with her at our lunch this year out in Chicago. So I could go on and on, but there's no shortage of new folks coming into the Democratic caucus, and of course Peter Welch joining the U.S. Senate, and John Fetterman, very exciting additions to our camp in the U.S. Senate.
Thank you so much, Jim. And it's really exciting to hear about all those new faces that are going to be coming into Congress, and hopefully we'll be able to work with them in the coming months, and hopefully for much longer than that. So I'm going to ask Jim one more question, and then we're going to kick it back over to you, Jeremy, for final thoughts. And we were hoping that you could elaborate a little bit about the geographic breakdown of the poll in terms of where those 800 voters were, and were there any trends that you saw in that as well?
Sure. Let me quickly look that up. I mean, we do draw representative based on where, based on the Pew data in terms of, I know I mentioned gender and age. We also do it based on regions, so that we have a population that's reflective of the Jewish population in terms of where they live. And just to give everybody a little bit of a lesson in this, so 25% live in the states that are characterized as West. We have 10% in the states that are characterized as Midwest. So I believe about 49% in the Northeast. For Northeast, we include Washington, D.C. and Virginia because they culturally feel more Northeast than they do South. That's one difference from how we define it than others. And then the remainder being in the South. The strongest Jewish support, it varies, but you can see it's pretty strong across region. I'm a little hesitant on sample sizes because it's highest in our smallest sample sizes of the Midwest and the West. But basically, I'd say you get anywhere from 70 to 85% support by region. And so not a lot of regional differences. And I think part of what's going to drive that also is the races that are taking place at that time. We may have a slightly inflated number in the South right now because of the Raphael Warnock race, which was so competitive. Yeah, that's probably overstating it a little bit because it's not that large of Georgia doesn't make that much of the South. But long story short, it's it support for the Jewish candidate, so transcends region quite strongly.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jim. So I'm going to now turn it over to Jeremy for closing and final thoughts. And before I do, I want to thank everyone who was able to join us on this call. Jim, thank you. It's been incredibly enlightening. And without further ado, over to Jeremy.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kevin. Thanks, Jim. I just want to remind folks that they can go to jstreet.org/polling to find not only all the specific results of this poll, but actually all the back data over the years. And I think it's really important, as Jim said, that not only did we sample this 800 folks, but if you then add up the 6 or 8 other election night surveys that we've done, we've sampled thousands of voters over time, and so much of the data, Jim, is relatively consistent over time. And I'd highlight 2 things that I think are really critical to this election. One is that Jewish Americans, by and large, are very connected to Israel, and at the same time, very comfortable with the idea that they can be critical of what's going on in Israel. And I think that the thought that this community is best represented by organizations who say that one simply has to support Israel right or wrong, and that one can't raise issues publicly, that is simply a flawed assumption. And a group like J Street that is trying to carve out this, we support Israel, but we're ready to call out the things that we think are not in keeping with our values and our interests, that represents the clear majority of the American Jewish community. At the same time, a new dynamic was introduced in this election, which is the notion that the pro-Israel community might be willing to put its support behind people who are going to undercut our own democracy, simply because those people are willing to support Israel right or wrong, or line up under a pro-Israel banner. And I think this survey and other data that we are seeing indicates just how clearly wrong that presumption is. And so those organizations that claim the only way to be pro-Israel is to support Israel right or wrong, and that it really doesn't matter what you think about any domestic issue, you'll get Jewish support as long as you're supporting Israel, those 2 assumptions are wrong. And J Street stands for the proposition that we share a set of democratic values, a set of Jewish values that we apply in the United States and in Israel. We will not stand for people who undercut the foundations of our democracy, and we will stand up and criticize those who are looking to undercut those democratic foundations in Israel. And similarly, we are going to stand up and say that we want to see the values that we hold most dear prioritized by the candidates that we support. And in this election, it was democracy, it was the right to choose, but we know that all across our community, the environment, education, all form of rights of every community, these are the things that the American Jewish community cares about, and we will not lend our support to candidates simply because they are willing to endorse what Bibi Netanyahu and the settlers are standing for. And so I think those are really important closing thoughts that really indicate why this is a moment of opportunity for J Street to come to be seen as clearly the political home of the center of the American Jewish community. We are pro-Israel, pro-peace, pro-democracy, and we're the majority of this community. So I thank you, Jim, for your data. I thank all those who've been sticking with us throughout. Thanks to Kevin and his incredible team who ran our political operation, who ran our new super PAC. It was really a tremendously successful cycle. In the course of this call, we found out that we endorsed in, I think, 16 of those toss-up races, and we won 15 of the 16 toss-up races in which J Street was involved, which is an incredible track record. So thank you to Kevin and the team. Back to you, Kevin.
Thank you for that, Jeremy. I know our everyone on the public affairs team really appreciates that. And to everyone on this call, Jim, Jeremy, it's always a pleasure to listen to you both talk about this and about the issues that affect our community. As Jeremy said, if you were interested in this polling information and want more information, jstreet.org/polling. That's where you can find this poll and every other poll that we have done since I think 2010 or so. But for those of you who stuck with us, we really appreciate it. And stay tuned for our next thing, our next J Street that we're going to do in probably a couple of days or so. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you. Bye.